Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming down here today. Due to a number of recent shootings, there's been a lot of media and public interest in the topic of gun violence in our city. So I'm here today to discuss some of those trends we're seeing and what we're doing in response. In late 2019, like other law enforcement agencies, we identified an upward trend in gun violence and took steps to improve our response to gun crime and those who perpetrate it. This included the creation of a dedicated Firearms Investigations Unit, or FIU. This unit is tasked with investigating, monitoring, and coordinating investigations into criminal networks, street gangs, and individuals involved in gun crime. Beginning in 2020, the unit also started tracking gun crime in a much more detailed way than had been done before in our service. From this analysis, we know that last year, 1,633 firearms were seized. This is up considerably from 1,125 the year before. These numbers do not include imitation firearms, which are even more prevalent on our streets. This is especially concerning because imitation firearms are used to threaten, intimidate, and victimize the community in similar ways as actual firearms. They look real and are treated as real by both police and those that are victimized by violent crime involving imitation firearms. And in confrontation with police, unless otherwise known, an imitation firearm is just as deadly a threat as a real one. In terms of shootings, there have been 29 shooting events in 2022 so far. 9 of those shootings took place this month, 5 of which occurred just recently in 4 days between March 10 and 14. Last year we had 150 shooting occurrences, which was down slightly from the 158 in 2020. Of the 150 in 2021, 108 are believed to be targeted events. 89 resulted in injuries, up to and including death caused by firearm. And almost half of the 2021 events had the potential for innocent bystanders to be harmed. This includes cases where shots were fired into the air, at residents, vehicles, or in other public spaces. In 7 of these occurrences, children were present or in the vicinity. Similarly, of the 9 shootings we've seen so far in March, 6 of them had the potential for bystanders, including children, to be harmed. As you saw in the videos we shared with you this morning, we are seeing incidents of brazen gunfire on our streets, in residential neighborhoods and other public places, and that is very concerning. This type of reckless behavior is an unacceptable threat to our community, and we will remain relentless in our efforts to identify and charge those responsible. In addition to the work of our Firearms Investigation Unit, in 2021 we created a Firearms Examination Unit, which processes firearm evidence and performs ballistic analysis that helps link guns to crimes. We work with local, provincial, and national law enforcement partners to find linkages between shooting events and those who perpetrate them. In its first year of operation alone, our Firearm Examination Unit provided leads and linkages to 39 different investigations. Firearms investigations are complex and resource intensive, requiring sophisticated investigative techniques and subject matter experts. And we continue to build that expertise in-house, which allows us to link and solve more shootings in a timely fashion. As well, through intelligence and analysis, we have enhanced our ability to identify trends and, in some cases, prevent targeted acts of violence. Unfortunately, gun crime and the violence associated with it continues to increase, not only here in Edmonton, but nationally and south of the border. At present, we are building upon our current strategy and working on short, medium, and long-term gun and gang violence reduction strategies that will focus on prevention, suppression, and investigation of gun crime and gang violence. Chief McPhee has said many times, there's a big difference between social disorder and the type of violent, reckless crime we are seeing that includes gunfire in restaurants with families present, neighborhoods where children are playing, and public streets where innocent people are going about their day. Along with support from the community, our frontline officers, investigative units, and specialized areas like firearms investigation and examination units and drug and gang enforcement will remain focused on violent offenders and criminal networks who knowingly put the public at risk with no regard for the safety of innocent people. We are committed to this work and will continue to hold those accountable for the harm they do in our communities. To those involved in gun or gang violence, enough is enough. Whatever your intentions are, take a moment to consider the unintended consequences of your actions and potential to harm innocent people. We will remain relentless in our pursuit of you and hold you accountable to the harm you're doing in our communities. Staff Sergeant Eric Stewart is with us here today. He and I will take questions now. Eric oversees our firearms investigations unit and our gang suppression team. So we'll be happy to answer your questions.
I got one. How are people getting these guns? Like, how is this happening? And are you guys tackling that source? How are you tackling that source?
Good question, and there isn't a simple answer, and maybe I'll invite Eric. A lot of them are domestically sourced through a variety of means. Eric's got a wealth of experience in firearms investigation, so maybe I'll let him speak to the flow and the source of guns we're seeing on the street.
Good morning, everybody. To answer your question, what we're seeing trends here in Alberta especially is a lot of the firearms, like the superintendent said, are domestically trafficked. So they're ending up on our streets through different ways. Individuals, we talk about straw purchasers. We've done some media releases on some of those investigations, where an individual has a firearms license, and then what they do is they get involved in some of these groups in these criminal activities, and their firearms license is utilized to purchase firearms for organized crime groups or gangs or networks. And that's one way we see is a common way how firearms are getting on our streets. Another way is the residential and business break and enters that are happening is another way those firearms are getting here. Unlike what's happening out east where they get a lot more firearms coming across the border, we don't see that as much here in Alberta.
You mentioned that a lot of these brazen shootings, there's bystanders, public kids, you know. Should the public be concerned? Should they be scared, and what can they do?
Well, I think we're all concerned, and the more gunplay there is in the street, the more opportunity there is for unintended consequences and somebody to be injured. That said, the majority of these events are targeted events where there is an intended target versus it just being a random act. But we're concerned, and I know there is concern in the communities. You know, when we have conversations with community groups and neighborhoods after a shooting occurs in their neighborhood, there is a lot of concern both in the community and from our perspective.
What are some of the key points that you guys are doing to mitigate this, this rising gun violence and trend?
Well, I think part of it is just, through intelligence and trying to be proactive in arming ourselves with the technology and the investigative capacity to investigate these. But more importantly, and areas that we continue to work on is just from a prevention standpoint. A lot of that is intelligence-led, but getting out in front and trying to understand what's contributing to escalating violence that rises to the level of firearms being involved.
You said the majority are targeted. On the fact sheet that was sent out, it looked like there was one in March that was not targeted. Do you have details on that?
Do you know which one you're specifically referring to?
It just showed numbers. Like, of the 9, it only showed 8 as targeted. Do you have details on why one wasn't targeted this month?
I'm not sure. Sorry, I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, we can look into that for sure.
Okay. And in terms of the public knowing, I mean, some of these instances that we got in the news release today, the public wouldn't have necessarily known about this because media no longer has access to scanners. So how is the public supposed to know how bad it is when we don't even get releases on when there is a brazen shooting until months later? Well,
I think it gets reported overnight or occasionally when there are a shooting event in the neighborhoods, and we do a lot of door-to-door and canvassing a lot of times after the fact, looking for evidence and assistance from the community. So there's an opportunity then for us to engage with that specific neighborhood and community as to what took place and answer any questions that they have.
But why not the public, the broader public?
That's a good question, and I really don't have an answer as to. Every day we try and balance, what what goes out to the media and whether it's for investigative purposes or whatever we hold on to for a period of time. But I think there isn't a simple answer to that. It's a combination of things.
And I mean, if I can jump in, I would say that most of the time when there's a shooting, there ends up being some sort of a media email that gets sent out. And certainly when there's a homicide, there's always an email sent or a media release that goes out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In terms of the what's happening now in the community, I guess for you as someone who's watching it from a policing standpoint, how concerned are you, and how concerned do you think the public should be?
Well, we're concerned certainly. Anytime there's acts of violence that escalate to this level, it's concerning. Our job as a police service is to protect the community, and sometimes it's difficult when the level of violence escalates to the point that it does on occasion, and there is a feeling of us trying to catch up and stem and reverse that trend. As for the community, I think firearms violence aside, we're seeing escalating violence in a lot of other areas as well that involve other weapons and acts of violence or intimidation, robberies, personal robberies, those sorts of things.
I think this is the third year in a row where we've had sort of a press conference about gun violence and the problem with gun violence in Edmonton. Wondering if you've seen sort of changes in that time as far as what you're seeing on the street, whether that's different types of weapons being used or a change in target versus non-target. I guess what are you seeing over the course of this period?
Well, I think whether we're talking, and I'll ask Eric maybe to piggyback on this, but whether we're talking about knives or bear spray or firearms, we're seeing an escalation in the use. People aren't afraid to use those sorts of weapons, and they're being used more often than they have in the past. But this is something that we're not alone in this. This is right across the country and down into the United States, where homicide rates are hitting record levels, south of the border in a lot of major cities. So it's a real broad trend that we're seeing right throughout North America.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just add to that. Yeah, and what's happened, and I think what you talked about 3 years, is we started our firearms program in EPS, which was about 3 years ago. So we were able to start tracking some of this intelligence, providing analytics to that, and then focusing our efforts in those areas where we see that. So, and I will say this, what we're seeing, and the superintendent talked about it, the brazenness of these shootings is what's concerning of us too, right? They may be targeted event, but what's happening is these individuals involved in these gun battles or gun crime aren't thinking about what's on the other side of that other person they're targeting, right? So we're seeing a lot of that now. We as the police are very concerned about that, but again, we need the community and the people involved in these crimes, whether they're victims, witnesses, to come forward to the police, and that's a huge step for us to get that to happen, right? We get a lot of uncooperation sometimes in some of these investigations, understandably why sometimes, but if we had that cooperation from these victims and witnesses that see some of this stuff, it would help us. But the brazenness of these shootings is definitely, I would say, escalating, and why that trend is happening, we can't tell you, but it's definitely concerning to all of us.
Do you tie it to the pandemic at all? It sort of seems to just sort of line up, but do you tie it to the pandemic at all?
I don't tie it to that at all, actually. These individuals that get involved in gun crime has nothing to do with the pandemic. They have other means why they're involved in this activity. Criminal activity, drug dealing, they use these guns for a purpose, right? So other beside that.
Is there an increase of gang activity? Is that the cause behind these shootings?
I wouldn't say gang activity, and it's always been here, whether it's criminal networks or organized, disorganized gangs in the city. There's always been a presence. It kind of year over year and throughout the year, I think the amount of their violence and their activity in the city kind of ebbs and flows. Sometimes we see, and a lot of it's reflected in the statistics provided to you this morning as far as an increased number of shootings in a particular month. A lot of times, again, those are targeted, and they're opposing groups that have had some sort of disagreement, and their violence has escalated to a back and forth. But as far as an increase in gang presence in the city, I would suggest there isn't. It's just we've always had it, and historically their violent activities has kind of ebbed and flowed, throughout the years.
So this could be just another ebb, but is this more of a trend or an ebb? How do you see it for the increase?
Well, I mean, firearm seizures are trending up. Gang-related and firearm-related homicides are trending up. So I would say it's more of a trend in that regard. But to say that it's due to an increase in the number of gangs or criminal networks operating in the city, I wouldn't go that far.
Now there were 3 unsolved cases that you're releasing video of today. I was wondering if one of you could comment on these cases and the brazen nature of them and why you're looking for more help on this today.
Yeah, they are still ongoing investigations, but part of the reason why we wanted to release those to you guys is twofold: to show you what's happening out there, and secondly, is we're still looking for information in relation to those shootings. So those are ongoing investigations. These are always challenging, complex investigations. When you have people targeting each other in events like that, you're already behind the 8 ball trying to get information who's involved in these investigations, right? So we can't provide a lot of details as they are ongoing, but we are seeking assistance from the public, we hope. As you can see in those videos, they're pretty scary. There's bystanders and children and people around, and that's where I go to the brazenness of this. The individuals involved in these crimes need to be held accountable, and that's by people coming forward and helping us with this. So.
And I mean, again, not going into specifics of the case, but could you talk about how these three instances maybe play into the larger picture? These are 3 that are still ongoing, but is this what we're seeing in the other cases that are solved? Is it that same sort of gunfire that we're seeing, that same brazenness?
When we talk about brazen, we talk about these targeted events. So we're not seeing a lot of random acts out there. So when there's a targeted event like we've seen in those 3 shootings, those are individuals trying to locate each other for the purpose of shooting at each other. But what happens is we see in these is when it comes brazen is all the bystanders around, right? Homes, people, vehicles, kids, children all around that area. We're not seeing all of our shootings to that type of extent on what's going on here. If there's a targeted shooting, the carnage after that isn't as bad as sometimes we see in those, right? But those are just a showcase of some of what we're dealing with and why we do need the assistance from the public to try to solve those.
I'm thinking back to the budget discussions that were happening, last December, and Chief McPhee explained to council, a number of instances, recent instances, and sort of the trends that he was seeing and violent crime that he was seeing, in and around the budget discussions. And he got some criticism on that, people thinking he was sort of fear-mongering and sort of maybe not exaggerating, but pointing up to the worst when it's not always kind of like that. Are you trying to find a line between warning the public and asking for awareness and help and scaring people?
Well, the last thing we want to do is scare people, but at the same time, we don't want to paint a picture that isn't truly what the potential of what could be happening in any corner of the city. So it's a balance. Fortunately or unfortunately, on occasion, innocent people get caught in the middle of this. But that's the reality, and that's what we're faced with, and I think the community deserves to be aware that there is potential for it, but some of the story behind it is these are, by and large, targeted events. So the community themselves aren't being targeted, they just happen, these are occurring in the community.
This year, the gun occurrences down slightly. My understanding is in 2020, in terms of gun injuries and deaths, it was well over 100. We've got 89 this year. Would you say that's part of the ebb and flow, or is there a reason there's been that, quite significant lowering of injuries and deaths compared to the year previous.
Unless Eric thinks otherwise, I think it's difficult to say. The numbers are fairly consistent as far as 150, 158 shooting occurrences in a year, and that's, you know, anytime a firearm is discharged, you know, in public, essentially. Sometimes people get hit and injured, and sometimes they don't. So I think there is some randomness to, you know, the number of injuries that result as part of an occurrence. Anything further on that?
Sorry, and I would also say, in saying that, we've had some luck out there in some of these shooting incidents, you know, where people targeting each other didn't hit each other, right? But it's not so much about the targeting. I go back to this, it's what else happens beyond those targets, right? So we've been fortunate so far. I'd say the target events are up, injuries are consistent, they're high, but overall, we've just been lucky on a few incidents.
Is there any concern that the targeting and the death of Abdullah Shah, Carmen Pervez could ramp things up?
There's nothing to suggest that there could be fallout, you know, to what you're speaking of. You know, criminal activity, criminal networks, you know, the criminal element in the city, it's always kind of in a state of flux. You know, people come, people go, people move away. You know, reality is some people die, but it really doesn't dramatically change the landscape, or, you know, they're always in flux.
For someone who has no understanding of how policing works and police networks work, what can you tell them that police are doing to keep them safe?
What can we tell the...
Someone who doesn't understand policing.
Right.
So as simplified as you can, what are police doing right now to keep the community safe?
Sure. Well, I would say everything from our frontline officers, our beat members, you know, the boots on the ground, right up through, you know, our investigative areas and our specialized areas. You know, we're committed and we're aware and committed to preventing violence and keeping guns out of the hands they shouldn't be in. It's a tall task, and it's complex, and I think we do have some wins in that area, but you know, every time there's a shooting or an event, it leads to further investigation. And I just want to circle back to the assistance from the community. We've mentioned it a few times. The shooting a couple of weeks ago at the Urtail Lounge, I think we reported or provided a media release last week. That's a perfect example of patrol and our first responders getting there, and supports from Air One to stabilize that scene, treat those that were injured. But what I want to touch on and stress is the role the community played in that. Like, they really rallied, and our requests for people to come forward with porch video, dash cam video, that really was, when it was all stitched together, that was an integral piece of putting that investigation together in a matter of 3 days or so. We had laid charges on 2 people, first-degree murder charges, warrant for a third, but we had a really good and complete sort of understanding as to the before and after, and credit to that Inglewood community and their response.
And I mean, that goes to the nuance of this as well, that we're talking about some of the unsolved, but the majority of gun violence in the city has been solved. Is that fair to say?
I don't know if it's been solved. I mean, there's a continuum between having an idea as to who's involved and then getting to a point where, you know, there's grounds to lay charges. That's a pretty broad continuum. The front end of that is kind of the intel piece, and what allows us to be a bit proactive in you know, getting out in the community and speaking with some of these people that are involved, and kind of providing them a warning that you know, we kind of have an idea what's going on, and those that are intended targets, warning them too that they may face some jeopardy from, you know, from someone who's opposed to them.
Is this happening?
What is a straw purchaser? You mentioned that?
Yeah, we've had a few media releases in relation to the Firearms Investigation Unit investigating these types of investigations. Like I said before, someone with a lawful firearms license is allowed to possess and purchase firearms, is then goes and purchases firearms for individuals or groups that aren't allowed to do that. that don't have a lawful license to do it. So they're purchasing the firearms and then putting them into these groups in the hands on our streets of these individuals, gang members, groups, networks that aren't allowed to have firearms.
Do you need more resources? Is this something more funding could help address?
Leave that to you.
The short answer is certainly. I mean, within our organization, and we've got a fixed budget, and it's endured some challenges over the last couple of years. But internally, we're always looking at ways to move resources around to respond to, what's creating the most harm in the community. So that's ongoing, and that's something that. But it's always at the sacrifice of something else. So it's prioritizing our programs and the delivery that we provide to the community, and balancing that with, what's causing the most harm within the community. I think part of, I referenced the strategy that we're modernizing with regards to gun and gang violence. That's something we're working on right now. Part of that may include or may assist us in identifying if we really want to enhance or take our current capacity to another level. That may involve additional resources that we don't have.
And is this happening, citywide, or is there a certain area of the city that might be seeing more of the violence?
It's really hard to predict. I think the videos that were provided to you this morning, one was in North Edmonton, one was on the Henday, one was in South Edmonton. So it can happen anywhere. It's just a matter when two groups that have a beef with each other happen to cross paths. Regardless of what part of the city they're in, they have plans for each other.
Anything we haven't asked you about that you think people should know about?
Well, I'd just like to reiterate that we're very alive to the fact that this is concerning, and the trending up in firearm seizures and shooting events is top of mind, and day in and day out we're looking at ways to respond to it better. Again, both from a preventative and a suppressing it from happening, right to when it does happen, our ability to respond and investigate and hold those accountable who are doing it.
There's a targeted incidents. Is the increase in gun violence at all tied to criminals who would be committing crimes anyway, robberies and stuff like that, and they wouldn't have had guns in the past? Now suddenly they have access to guns. Is that in any way a part of this, or is it mostly sort of targeted things where people would always have had guns and there's just more of that happening?
I'm trying to understand your question.
Yeah.
Well, the reality is we're seizing more guns, so it's reasonable to assume that there's more guns on the street. Like Eric mentioned, there's numerous ways that these guns can, go from one hand to another and into the hands of those who, have ill intent. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah. Is there any possibility that you're seizing more guns because your team is more aware? You have this guns unit. Is that potentially at play?
I think that may be part of it, but we kind of look at the number of guns that are seized out of vehicles, and a lot of those are by our frontline members conducting vehicle stops. That's concerning, to police officers in the course of their duties and subject in vehicle stops. We're seizing more guns, so that's concerning on our end. But again, I think it just speaks to more and more people are choosing, to protect themselves or carry firearms than we've seen in past years.
And are the majority of these illegal or legal guns?
The majority of them are obtained illegally, certainly, yeah.
This is a trend across America, Canada. I'm not sure if you can answer this, but I think you have to ask, why. Is there any leading theories as to why we're seeing this increase in terms of firearms violence?
Boy, that's a good question.
I don't know. I think I would just, there's definitely, what we're seeing is we see a lot of these, and they touched on a lot, so a lot of these groups come together for the purpose of criminal activity. And what we're seeing when that happens is they get involved in violence to protect themselves or go on the offensive and do other things, right? So I think across the country and into the US, guns are more available. People find ways to find these firearms, and when they have these firearms in their possession, they're using them. And that's not a good thing. So I don't know if there's one specific trend, but these groups are definitely more brazen and more willing to shoot at each other when it comes to that.
Is the brazenness of this actually helping you guys a little bit? The fact that it's happening more in public and, you know, maybe daylight hours, stuff like that, shining lights on them that you wouldn't normally have because of their actions?
I don't know if it's helping us, but it gives us, you know, I think this type of firearms, it has increased for sure, but I think we've had this in our communities prior to this historically. But we are definitely seeing a generation of people that aren't afraid to go into a public place or all time hours a day in a community and fire a gun. And in the past, we didn't see that as much. I'm talking historically 5-10 years ago, right?
Is it exposing vehicles and people and stuff like this that maybe you guys didn't know about?
No, we have pretty good intelligence, and no, we have analytical work that goes on in the EPS, and like the superintendent said, and you go back to your question about solving these, is we have a good idea who's involved. It's just a matter of how do we get to the end game and get those to court. And I will say when we do get to court, our Alberta Crown Prosecution Service have done a fantastic job of supporting us in these investigations and holding these people accountable too when we get to court.
Police have guns too, and occasionally you're required to use them. Is I guess to what extent, you know, I guess by definition, if you're using a gun, that's gun violence, I suppose. I guess to what extent, you know, are police contributing to gun violence levels in the city, or at all? Do you see that at all?
You mean in statistics?
Well, yeah, I guess in statistics, or just, you know, how often are police being forced or required or deciding to use guns in these instances? You know, I guess you're not there at the time all the time, but I guess are police being required to use their guns more often now as well?
Well, to your point, police have always carried guns and have always, unfortunately, there's been occurrences where they need to be used. But I think we're seeing maybe more opportunity, or just given the fact, I'm not sure, 116 firearms seized out of cars. Anyway, the point being, with an escalation or a trending up in people carrying weapons, and then police having interaction with essentially more armed people, our training hasn't changed a whole lot. Police officers are trained to de-escalate right from first contact through verbal direction, and pending on what they're seeing and the totality of the circumstances, they've got a variety of options beyond verbal direction. Thankfully, the vast majority of the time, verbal direction will de-escalate the situation and nothing has to come off of their belt. But sometimes, despite verbal direction, it's not followed. That escalates up into whether it's CEWs or tasers, or just drawing of a taser or a firearm. Sometimes that does the trick. But the more often we have interaction with armed people, the more we got to rely on that training and respond to the threat or the person that you're presented with.
So yes, but it's appropriate response to the situation.
Certainly, and I can tell you, no police officer comes to work every day wanting to be in that situation, but just by virtue of our occupation, that's part of our duty to respond to.
You had mentioned imitation firearms in your opening remarks, and you said we're seeing more of these. Do you have statistics, and are these imitation firearms illegal as well? I don't know the legalities of them.
Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but yes, we're seeing more of them. I don't know the exact number, but we're seizing them at an increasing rate out on the street. By and large, most of them aren't illegal. They're pellet guns or airsoft guns. But what I will say is they are so lifelike that we could put a table down in front of us right now and lay 10 guns out and 3 of them are imitation or 3 of them are real, none of us would be able to look at that and say which one is which. So you kind of transpose that into a back alley at 2 in the morning, and all of a sudden a police officer is in an encounter. They've got split seconds to make that determination, but that's where they rely on their training and respond with the appropriate use of force, de-escalation, whatever you want to call it. But that's what they're faced with.
I can add something to that. Just in relation to imitation firearms, what we're seeing out there as well is individuals are converting imitation firearms to real firearms. So I won't get into the meat and potatoes and the weeds of that, but that is occurring, and that's across the country. That's into the U.S. So an imitation firearm is being converted, and so when we're dealing with some of these firearms, whether it's imitation at the end and at the time, we just don't know. This is occurring across the country and into the U.S. as well too. So they're finding a way to make an imitation firearm real. So we do see that as well.